We will now begin our panel session. Please note that this panel session will be focused on the discussion, only leaving some room for a Q&A if that's possible, but we will prioritize the discussion among the panelists. I'm pleased to introduce Sammy Pritchard, Director of Advocacy and Communications at the YWCA Toronto, and one of our provincial advisory group members at the Learning Network. Sammy will be moderating this session and will open the panel by introducing our panelists. Welcome, Sammy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And welcome to our panel titled Transformative Justice in Action, Reimagining Gender-Based Violence Support and Accountability. As Margarita said, my name is Sammy Pritchard, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm really honored and grateful to be able to join all of you today to serve as the moderator for today's session and to be accompanied by such incredible panelists. Over the next hour, we're going to be exploring some of the principles and applications of transformative justice within the context of gender-based violence, really leaning into how it can be applied to support survivors, those who have caused harm, and communities more broadly. It is my hope for the next hour to do very little talking so as to ensure you can soak up all of the wisdom and insights our panelists have to share today. And so with that, I see our panelists have turned on their cameras, and I'm going to jump right in with introducing them. So first, I'd like to welcome Jenna Forbes. Jenna is a proud First Nations woman with roots in the Gitxsan, Tsimshian, and Haida territories of British Columbia. Jenna was born in Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and currently lives in Vancouver. Jenna is the Chief Executive Officer of Vancouver Aboriginal Transformative Justice Services Society, a role she has held for 7 years. As CEO, Jenna uses traditional Indigenous approaches to support community members in conflict with the law. Primary services include criminal diversion, Indigenous resource workers within corrections and local courthouses, and various crime prevention projects. Welcome, Jenna. Next up is Dalia Israel. Dalia is Tsalal Sexual Violence Support Services Executive Director. She began her journey at Tsalal in 2002 as a volunteer and later went on to join the Victim Services Program in 2005. For the past 20 years, she has had the honor of supporting survivors as they navigate systems after sexual violence and harm, while also amplifying survivors' voices in circles of influence in order to make substantive changes that reflect the lived experience of the survivors Tsalal serves. Thank you for joining us. And our third panelist today is Misanka Mupezi. Excuse me if I pronounced your last name wrong. I'll look for correction and welcome it. Is a dedicated social worker and sex educator with many years of experience. Specializing in sex education for youth, she creates empowering programs that promote informed decision-making about bodies and relationships. Additionally, she has extensive experience supporting Black communities through grief and providing culturally competent care that honors individual experiences. Thank you three so much for being here today. I am looking forward to seeing how the conversation unfolds. And with that, I think we'll dive straight into the questions. Dalia, the first question will go to you first, and then we'll move through to Jenna and Misanka, but I thought to give you a heads up. So our first question, transformative justice, as we know, has deep roots in community-based efforts to address violence, harm, and abuse, particularly within, for example, Indigenous, Black, racialized, queer, and immigrant communities. And I'm hoping you can share a bit about how this historical context influences your understanding and practice of transformative justice in the gender-based violence or GBV sector.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one that we took really front and center when we initiated our pilot project at Tsalal. And I think what a lot of our learning taught us was that TJ, as it's often referred to, does belong to community. So I think many times when we're trying to find a lot of other menu options for gender-based violence survivors to have outside of the carceral system that may never be a system that they want to engage in, we kind of look back to community that many of us come from and are often raised by to find solutions. And one of the biggest pieces that we took into consideration was the fact that as nonprofits, that are moving into the space to offer more menu options. We are also a system. And so we have to really honor the roots that we're coming from, but also the space that we're taking up. And so we really thought about it as a tripartite agreement between us and survivors and those that caused harm. And eventually, through that process, recognized that we couldn't call our project transformative justice because it wouldn't be right or fair or true to community, and ended up settling on reimagining justice, because that's ultimately what we were hoping to do, and to blend many of the practices that we had been gifted through connection with Indigenous communities on these lands, also restorative justice practitioners, and taking loads of lessons from folks like Miriam Kaba and all of the practitioners out of Black communities that have been forging this work ahead, both in Canada and the United States. So yeah, it's an interesting time to be thinking about how we can strategically offer another option to survivors that is broad, and because there are tons of survivors that are looking for other options, but also really being cautious around not taking things away from community, but being of use to community.
Thanks so much for that. I liked what you pointed out around nonprofits also being a system and the need to consider that and honor those roots. And so lots to tease out there, but thank you. And Jenna, I'll pass the same question over to you when you're ready.
Amakan Lak, that means good morning in my language. It's Simshan or Smelyak. I want to share gratitude for the lands that I'm on first. So I'm in Vancouver, so I'm on the shared territories of the Squamish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So very happy to be here on their unceded lands. But my roots are traditionally from three northern areas. So I am from the House of Gitindo, which is Tsimshian and Lakwalams. I'm also from Wilpwiget, who is in the Kiksang community, and Skidance, which is in the Haida territories. So gratitude for Sami for trying to say those names. I know it's not like a traditional tongue, so good job. I want to share gratitude too to Grace for starting us in a good way. This is the start of our laws when we start our day with protocol, and we start our day with prayer, because we're really providing some time to ground ourselves, call our spirits within ourselves, and also allow our ancestors some time and space to come into the room. So really that's part of our Indigenous law and part of our protocols that I like to see practiced, not just in Indigenous spaces, but in many of the meetings that we have now. I also want to share that when I share my territories and where I'm from, this is also part of our laws. So me carrying space in 3 houses means that I'm responsible to 3 places. It also means that when I share those things, that if you have praise that you want to give or questions, that you can always go to those houses, and I'm held accountable on a higher level than just myself. The work that I do is under the umbrella of transformative justice, but it's only because that's the closest English word that we have. Indigenous justice really isn't transformative justice. Transformation is a huge piece of our laws, but we don't actually have a word for justice. The closest that we have is what we call in Tsimshian is our adawak, and that's our way. So there are things that take us away from our way and things that will bring us back. And so our laws are really focused on the laws of connection. And connection is not just about humanity as well. You know, humanity is a big part of it, but the criminal system definitely, leaves out humanity, but our laws are bigger. It is based on our connection to ourself, our connection to others, our connection to community, and our connection to nature and how they all interact with each other. So I just want to be clear that transformative justice is not Indigenous justice. It's just the closest that we have. Restorative justice is also not Indigenous. But again, it's a close word, and it's a piece of maybe what is transforming. I think that if I focus more on the word transformative, that being a common concept, it's really about creating opportunities for those involved to speed up the process to bring you back to your purpose and your way. So I think many people have heard us speak about we consider the 7 generations behind and the 7 generations ahead. And I think when we talk about transformation and how we speed up the process, it's are we going to heal in 7 generations, or are we going to do the work so that we heal in 2 generations? And I think the more that we talk about the things like we're talking about today, we're speeding up those processes. And that's really what transformation is about: creating more love within ourselves and better connections with each other. Public speaking is not my favorite place to be, but the opportunity to speak between, with 900 people, that's an amazing connection that we get to share today. So happy to be here. You'll hear a little bit more about our Indigenous process as the questions go on.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Masanka.
Hi everyone. Can you hear me well? Because I wasn't there for the test. Yeah. Okay. I'm a little bit sick today, so my voice is a little bit in the back of my throat. So please don't hesitate to let me know if anything I say is not loud enough, is not clear enough, or I'm not articulating well enough. I'm gonna do my best. Um, and so to answer this question, so me when I think about the historical context and influence of transformative justice in general, I often think about like the history of violence that has been enacted. I work mostly with Black communities, so my community of focus is going to be Black communities, but I often think about the history of violence that's been enacted around towards the Black communities and marginalized communities. In general. And I also think about the resiliency that we've had. So, what has made us be able to still be here today and to still desire to fight and to still desire to show up as in community. And a lot of that has been having to exist outside of the traditional system of justice, I would say, not being able to reach out in the police in the way that other communities are able to, not be able to go see, I'm a social worker, but not being able to trust a social worker, to ask help for the way that you feel like you would need help. And a lot of that has been surviving towards surviving within community. So finding support within community, finding ways to be there for one another, even if sometimes it's not perfect. I still think that is a real there is a real strength in the way that we show up for community, in the way that we think, and in the way that we want to protect one another. And so for me, I think that the fundamental thing with transformative justice, or just rethinking justice, I would say, is really centered around community and the way that we desire to find the ways that we desire to show up for one another, and how can we transform that to be in the benefit of everyone, because we exist in a context where harm is going to happen. And because we are a small community and we tend to stay in community, harm is going to happen within the community also. So how do we show up for one another and make sure that everybody is protected in all the way that they need to be protected? So that is the way that I think often about the historical context. Yeah.
Thank you so much, folks, for starting us off in this way with this context and the thinking of how we envision, or you envision, this transformative justice. I'm gonna move us forward to the next question, and that is defining transformative justice, even more so, and how it can be applied to gender-based violence work to support survivors, those who have caused harm, as I said, and communities as a whole. And perhaps thinking a little bit more just about that historical context and teasing that out where possible as well. So Jenna, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you. Well, I struggle with the word justice, as we've already talked about before. I find that the word justice has become a very oppressive word and um, a very violent word. And I think that when I think about transforming justice or transformative justice, it's more about transforming the injustices that have happened. So we have to use this word in our organization, and it's more for a funding thing because we have to know what silo of funding that we're connected to. And the main funder is Department of Justice. But like I said, it really would come back to the laws of connection more than that. We do have to focus on injustice and rebalancing, but really we want to focus on revitalizing connection and love for each other. I think for any of the work that we do, it's really about creating opportunity for healing and for truth. And I think that the system that we have doesn't leave a lot of space for truth. And we are taught about this concept that's called the walking wounded. And so as you move along in your life, you're shot with different arrows that come along. And as you don't have the opportunity to do the healing, you carry many arrows with you. So when a person that's coming in your path to do transformative justice or an alternative, it's an opportunity to pull those arrows out so you aren't walking around as a partial person. And the work that you do when you take those arrows out is to refill the hole with something loving. Because if you're wounded yourself, you're more likely to wound others. So we really have to take a look at the truth of the situation and who's carrying what arrows and how we need to fix them. And whose responsibility is it for carrying those? And that's where community is really lost in a lot of our justice process. You know, like I mentioned before, the houses that I'm connected to are doing the work with me. But in this justice system, you stand alone, which really isn't what our spirit is supposed to do. We're supposed to stand with our family. We're supposed to not be embarrassed. We're supposed to find ways that are going to make each other better. And the more truthful we are in this process, the more we have the opportunity to get closer to our purpose. Because if we're carrying our half truths, we only do half the healing. So our job is really to use these transformative ideas to create that calling of the spirit home, to get their alignment happening and get their alignment moving towards where they need to be. So both the person who's been accused and the victim, you know, we don't want to hold either of them back. And we also want to give opportunities. It's not just those two in the room, it's community and everything that's been affected. So I think for gender-based violence, especially, you know, being a woman, it's creating safe spaces for anyone in the room. I'm just trying to take a look at my notes. One of the examples I had for taking partial responsibility, I have this basketball is really big in our community. We're very competitive. I'm super short, but us short girls can shoot some mean 3-pointers. So we're very competitive. There was a situation where there was 2 moms on the court having problems, and there was a dispute. And one of the moms ended up pushing another mom to the floor and kicking her and pulling and taking her purse. And so when we spoke to the victim, you know, we heard her story and how it affected her and how it affected her daughter and how it affected the team. But when we spoke to the person who was accused, and there was a lot of witnesses, she said, I'm only going to take responsibility for pushing her down, but I'm not going to take responsibility for taking her purse, which we know she did do. So we actually couldn't continue until she was ready to take that responsibility. Because if we went back to the victim and said, oh, she's only going to take responsibility for half, we're then perpetuating the cycle. So we really have to work with our person to take the full responsibility of what happened. You know, why is she having a hard time with this purse part? Why is this happening? Because it's also a burden that she's going to carry until she gets to a place where she can understand the harm that it's caused. I think that, you know, we can see a lot of this happening with truth and reconciliation. Only partial truths are coming out, and they want to move on to the reconciliation piece because truth is really uncomfortable. And we also don't have our words immediately because we haven't been given them. So you'll see with our process that we actually take 3 weeks in general to work with somebody to allow space for their truth to come out. So just allowing some time and space and truth is a really big part of it on both sides because it's going to affect their perception hugely. So, you know, gender wise, I think that it's harder for oppressed people and oppressed genders to actually safely say what's happening for them because they're not used to being allowed to have that. And I think their voices have been taken away so often and they're scared. You know, we have the word justice in our name, and just walking through our doors, they have no idea what to expect. But when they come through and they're allowed to just take a breath and start taking control of their own path, that's when healing starts. Sorry if I'm talking too long, let me know.
No, that's okay. You know, there's so many great pieces I was grabbing there that it's easy to get caught in the best way. I'll move us along a little quicker as we go, just a time check for all of us as we move through. But thank you so much, Jenna, for those insights. And I hear you and the using something other than the word justice. And I'm continuing to critically think about that as we go through the questions, but forgive me as we continue to use the word throughout as well, and welcome alternative suggestions. Okay, with that, we can move right along to Masanka whenever you're ready.
Sure. So to answer this question, because I work mostly with youth, I usually introduced or think of transformative justice, just to simplify it, usually with youth in a way that's like, how do we address conflict? How do we think conflict? Because I think since we live in a carceral system, sometimes the fear of doing the bad thing or the fear of hurting someone is often tied to being afraid of the consequences that will happen to us. So not slapping someone because we don't want to go to jail. As a kid, not stealing someone's lunch because you don't want to be yelled at by a teacher or by your parent. And so it's sometimes hard for it's not instinctive, I would say, for you to understand the consequence of their actions in regards to community, I would say. So I often introduce transformative justice as a way to reflect, how do we address conflict and how do we deal, let's say, with the uncomfortable emotions, or when we don't get what we want. So let's say when we think about consent and we tell people, you know, yes is yes and no is no. And then so for a youth, so then we teach them, like, you have to ask the proper way, you have to do the right thing and ask in the right way, and you will get a yes. But then sometimes you will get a no, even if you asked in the right way, if you did it in the proper way. And so oftentimes we don't really talk about the deception that comes with getting a no, with the sadness, or like you can get really annoyed, really frustrated because you didn't get the answer that you wanted. And so I often center transformative justice with youth in that reflection. How do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with deception? Because I don't think that in society we're being taught how to deal with conflict in the way that, like, there are going to be situations where you are in community with people, when you're faced with people that we don't vibe. I don't like this person and we just don't get along. But how do we still show up for one another? How do we still have the tough conversation? How do we still exist in community with one another without having the burden of faking, let's say, like a good relationship? I don't know if I'm answering the question. I feel like I'm going somewhere else, but I hope you are all following me. But yeah, as I was saying, so it's more so to think about that, really going to the root cause of like how do we address a conflict, and how do we develop like those talking skills? How do I actually tell someone I didn't like someone? I didn't like what you did, and how do I receive someone telling me also that they didn't appreciate my behavior, or they didn't like um what I said, or how I positioned myself in general. And then for me, I feel like that is the root cause of also understanding gender-based violence, specifically working with youth, because I think working with youth, what I often notice, like trespassing someone's boundary, I think when we're adults, we're just like, how could someone do something like that? But then when you work with kiddos that are younger, you do understand that like for some of them, it's really like nobody has ever told me why that behavior is not okay, and why that behavior is not okay to do to someone else, but also why that behavior is not okay for me to accept for someone to do to me. And so I think that often we bypass and expect that people will know the right things to do and why they should do the right things, but we never take the time to truly like, let me sit down with you and let us reflect why that is not a good thing to do. Let us think deeply, and let us like develop the skills to address those conflicts and to tell people why we don't like things, and to also be able to um set up boundaries for ourselves in general. I feel like I'm going far, but I think that was that was my thought.
It was a beautiful journey you took us on. Please don't question it at all. Delia, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Jenna, for just being the voice that always reminds me to slow down. So I want to backtrack a little bit and just acknowledge that I'm joining from Musqueam territory, and one of the oldest villages here on these territories. And we're right next to the water, so I take a lot of strength from that as well. Um, yeah, this is a really important question, and I've been really trying to stay present, listening to the brilliance that Jenna and Masanka is sharing. And I think what I would love to contribute um, is just a couple of things. One is that I think the impact of colonization on these lands has been that we are that our kinships have been broken, right? Whether we are uninvited guests to these lands or Indigenous people, the project of colonization has been to break those relationships with the land, with our four-legged friends, and with each other. And that means that so many communities don't have the attachment that is required in order to feel like we should and need to have each other's backs. And when that project is happening continuously today, and we have genocides happening around the world that are continuously making some people more important than others, um, the foundation for which we can transform ourselves and our relationships to ourselves and one another becomes deeply impacted. And I think sexual violence is a tool that is used to dominate, to have power over, and power is at play all of the time, and was a central kind of intent and project through colonization and colonial thinking. Um, so when we're thinking about how our society has grown to have responses um, that seem to only focus on the offender. So, whether that's going to jail or going before the court or reporting, um, it's a discharging, right? We want somebody else to take care of it. And we want to be, as survivors, what I've heard over the years, and as a survivor myself, that feeling of wanting someone to validate us for wanting that harm to have not happened. And so in our society where these these relationships and that kinship has been broken, this idea that somebody else should take care of it, somebody else should fix it, becomes our go-to and our norm. So we've also, even those of us that want something different, we've also been so deeply impacted by these unravelings of these teachings that have been here and obviously on many other lands around the world. And so when I think about defining a transformative justice, it's really not only about that interaction between one or two people or a group of people, but also changing the conditions around those folks that have just allowed that harm to happen in the first place. And that's really hard when we are also dealing with, with racism and misogyny and classism and people not getting their own needs met. There's so much happening in the ecosystem that people have been harmed within. So I think in order for us to be able to apply, a reimagined justice, a reimagined healing to folks who have experienced sexual harm and gender-based violence, it's going to take a ton of work for us as practitioners to be doing our own work. And I've been pumping Prentice Hemphill's book that they just wrote, How to Heal, because I think it has so many gifts across sectors that many of us need to be wrestling with ourselves. And I think also just recognizing that we have to continue to build this foundation outside of our organizations and in our own lives, so that we are priming the space for survivors to have access to these pieces. Because without community, without kinship, without attachment to each other and the earth and, all of us, recognizing that our liberation is bound up in each other, it's going to be really hard to bring these things to the people, right? And the resilience and the gratitude that I have for folks continuing to share teachings with me and with us is huge, because at this point nobody's proven that they should continue to teach settlers on these lands anything, but the generosity is so yeah, it just overwhelms me on a daily basis. But we have to focus on healing ourselves in order to heal the world and to also give people opportunities to heal.
Thank you three both so much for sharing. I found in all of your answers just really critical and important reminders about the ways in which folks define these concepts, and also the importance of keeping this work grounded in community, in connection, and in humanity, and the serious difficulty that can exist as we navigate doing this work through various oppressive systems and systemic barriers that are at play. So thank you very much. I'm going to move us ahead a bit in our questions, and this is going to be speaking to some examples from your practices. And so I'm just hoping you can share, like I said, examples from your practices or experience of transformative justice initiatives in the gender-based violence field that have shown promising results in promoting that healing and accountability that we discussed, and perhaps any lessons that we can draw from these examples as well. And Ms. Anka, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. As I said, so I work with youth a lot, and so I incorporate elements of transformative justice in every workshop that I offer. And I think that the basis of that is, so before even offering a workshop or creating a workshop for a specific community, I will take the time to speak with the youth that are going to be offered the workshop. So what would you want to hear? What do you want to learn about? What is even remotely interesting to you, to the product that you're about to receive? I think it's important I think transformative justice is that also, and an opposite to traditional justice also is this idea of like incorporated people in what they're going to receive as a service also. And so that's a part of the thing that I do that I find really important is always consulting the people that are going to receive the workshop, especially the youth, because I think with youth, with teenagers in general, we unfortunately tend to do this thing of like um deciding when they are deserving of agency. And so at times we will say, you are too young to know about XYZ. But then at other times, when the enacted behavior that is related to the topic that we told them, you're too young to learn about that, we will say, well, you should have known better. And so a lot of my work is allowing them to also have agency, to be able to have a say in what is being offered to them. And so for me, that's the first basis of also how I think transformative justice. And second to that is also to always let the work be like in continuous movement, I would say, because I think that um traditional justice also just never addresses the root cause of why someone ends up finding themselves in front of like the judge, let's say. And sometimes they do, but it's rarely when it's a marginalized person, when it's an indigenous person, when it's a Black person. We never get the backstory. We always end up being so surprised. A crime happens and we're just like, oh my God, how come? And we never question the conditions sometimes that lead someone to be in the position that they are in comparison to traditional to transformative justice. Does that work? To think about like like as a marginalized person, what are the 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 defining trait of your identity that sometimes can lead you to be more at risk of facing violence or more at risk of situations to be someone who is enacting um violence. And so I think when I do these type of work with kids in general is also to not shying away from having the real conversation, from addressing like their identity, who they are, how that has an impact of how they're perceived in the world, and how that has an impact to the treatment that they will receive in the world in general. And that I think tends to work well because it's also being honest with kids and being honest with teenagers in general. I don't think that they are not phased or touched by everything that is happening around them. They're really way more smart and knowledgeable that we give them credit for. And so for me, is to be anchored in the truth, and also going back to what I had said before, to really be intentional of thinking of ways to address conflict with them, and conflicts in a way that are like in their words. Like, what would you say to someone who did that to you? Okay, well, that would be a little bit harsh. How can we, wrap this up in something that is still truthful to what you would say, but still preserve like the depth of the way that you were hurt in this conflict that you want to communicate to someone. So yeah, I think it's just what I do in general. I answered.
That's great. Thank you so much. Dahlia.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we had a pilot project where we were really working to figure out how to do this from an organization, and it was a journey. It was definitely a journey, and we landed in a place where when so all of our programming was survivor driven. The survivor was the one to initiate any kind of process. And because we, at the end, ended up blending our analysis, which we identify as intersectional and feminist and anti-oppressive and decolonizing, alongside of some restorative justice principles, alongside of what is traditionally known as transformative justice, and we kind of put it all together as reimagining justice. We had two pieces that happened. One was a really long kind of multi-week intake with survivors about what their justice goals were, what their hopes were for the process, and that it needed to include their own personal work. So they were always connected to a counselor in-house We also had a group going called Accountability for All that looked at unraveling ourselves from that binary of like good and bad, survivor, victim, survivor, perpetrator, and really tried to look at things more holistically for folks. And then there were goals around community. So really looking at that, what are the conditions that allowed this to happen, and what are some community goals of how they wanted to start to transform those relationships. And that looked different for different folks. And once that piece was done, we really focused on whatever it was that was driving that desire around accountability at the end of the day for the survivor. And our pilot was looking at supporting 5 folks over the couple of years that we had the pilot going. And some folks just wanted support writing letters and having a template that they could write to the person that had harmed them, and wanted kind of a sounding board. Other folks wanted to run consent workshops in their communities. Other folks wanted to actually meet with the person that had harmed them, and we had dialogue with our partners at Just Outcomes that supported us. We also had things like a scholarship fund for people who had caused harm to be able to get the counseling and support that they needed, to ensure that, you know, work was being done on their end to be able to show up in a good way. We had elders connected to the project, and we were prioritizing and triaging queer and trans folks, Indigenous folks, sex workers, and Black folks in the program. So we can make some of those intakes and pieces available to folks if they would like. Happy to be in conversation around some of the bumps that came up along the way. But just honoring the fact also that particularly in BC that we have embargoes on using alternative justice for power-based crimes, and that in the late 90s there were strong voices because the province wasn't actually taking violence against women, and particularly violence against Indigenous women, seriously. There was a desire to not use whitewashed restorative justice principles in communities up the coast. So there is, I think there's lots of work that also needs to be done at bringing the restorative justice folks and the gender-based violence folks back together to continue to build in relationship with Indigenous communities all around this province of what is the right size response. We currently have a pretty big chasm between partners at this time, and to again build that foundation, right, is going to be so important to be able to bring this into a wider practice, and that's what we're also really committed to doing, because there is so much to learn, and to have many options for people, I think, is the ultimate goal.
Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing the example of your pilot and the work that went in behind it as well. Jenna, I'll turn it over to you to share some examples.
I really liked listening to the earlier speakers. It was Nenka and Elle, and they were talking about, how the colonial system isn't working and it's costing a lot of money. And I think it's important to recognize that this system, like was mentioned, wasn't really built for everybody. And if we look at the system today, the voice of the victim is extremely lost in law completely. When there is a conflict, the victim actually loses their voice and the victim actually becomes the queen. So that's why we have the crown speaking on behalf of the victim. And that's also why the victim really has a secondary voice to what's happening. So I think really what's essential is understanding that victim piece and really providing a powerful voice. and helping the person who has caused the harm to understand the depth of the victimization that's happened. So, we really have to take a look at the causes. If we think about, was this person intoxicated? We have to dig deeper than that. Why were they intoxicated that day? Are they angry? Are they depressed? Are they in grief? We have to take a look at that. And I think most victims really want to hear some context. They want to know, was this something random? Was it out of the blue? Was it targeted? Does this person have a history of doing this? They want to know, because it really affects how they're going to process the harm and how they're going to find relief in that pain. We have to take a look at the thefts. Is it because of greed? Is it because of poverty? Is it because of survival? Is it because their partner has just passed away and they were the main source of income? We have to take a look at context. The store, the mom and pop store that gets stolen from, they want to know what's happening for this person. I find a lot of them actually have some care and concern. They don't want to lose their money. They've worked hard to build these companies. They don't want to spend it on security or inflation. So we really have to get to the meat of what's happening. And I think these systems have to take the time and allow people the space to get truthful and to get nitty gritty. And these processes are often compared to saying it's a slap on a wrist. But you know what? There are times where I would rather sit in front of a judge that I do not know than sit in front of my grandmother and explain what I did to somebody else. So if I have to stand with my house, we have a thing coming up called Hobie, which is Nishka New Year, and I really encourage you guys to go if you're in BC. But you'll see if somebody leaves regalia on the floor, the item is held up and the person is called forward to say who owns this. And if you are the person that owns it, you have to go up and you have to dance for the regalia that you've lost. And you have to keep dancing until the speaker feels like you've learned your lesson. But not only do you have to dance, your whole clan has to come with you and stand by your side and take accountability for not watching their brother or their sister in maintaining what's happening. So there's depth to these truths as well. It's the humbling of accountability to your community, to yourself. If I cause harm to someone in an opposite clan, I not only have to make things right with that person, I have to make things right with the entire clan that's standing with them. And I have to be accountable to be asked questions from their leadership and listen to what needs to be done to rebalance. And when we practice those ways, that's what the rebalancing is. That's where we are humbled. Humbled is very important in learning. It's learning why our connections are important. And it's also about celebrating. We have to remember that justice is also about the great things. We also need to celebrate the gifts that are being brought to the table. My grandfather was an incredibly racist man, and he went to this grocery store every day, who happened to be owned by a Chinese man. And at the age of 80, he decided that Asian people were great. And, at 80, we need to celebrate those things, the changes that can happen just by simply allowing space to just be great humans. So I think that's all.
This is great. I feel like I am taking a million notes as I'm learning so much from all of you today. So thank you. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us. I think they each, demonstrate the potential of this work unfolding and this work in action in such unique ways. We have time for about one more question. And so I'm going to lead us to that final question, but I also want to just say that this is also an opportunity for you as panelists to share anything further you might want to share with the audience. So we'll jump forward. And that is just, what are the key opportunities that you see for growth or improvement in the application of this work within the gender-based violence sector? And how can we work towards that? And so, Dahlia, I'll start with you when you're ready.
Yeah, so I think as I mentioned earlier, and we had a secondary project that looked at a national coalition of sexual assault centers. And actually NECA was a part of that as well, where um, we were really chatting with each other about what is possible and what could a national strategy to roll out more options for folks look like. And I think what we realized is that so many of us um, who want to increase access to this type of programming, um, we haven't had the time to a like take a beat, figure out what are those foundational pieces that we need to do as healing for ourselves and maybe our organizations. Um, Lots of our organizations don't have HR practices that align with restorative and transformative principles. Um, many of us are in relationships with funders that are not secure. It really takes like an entire ecosystem to be able to respond. And so we ended up calling it like matching the inside to the outside, was a first step that many of us are going to have to really wrestle with. And so that's one big piece that Salal has been on the journey towards is rewriting policies and having practices around how we deal when harm is caused inside the organization, um, and ensuring that all of those pieces align. Um, yeah, so I think that there is work that needs to be done to just like prime our organizations to also create communities and spaces that start to repair that lack of attachment for so many folks that might not have roots on these lands, but still do want to engage in transformative justice. For many folks that don't have community, that don't have families, that don't have friends or people that they feel loved by, how do we achieve attachment and accountability for those folks as well? Um, and so really the work that we are focusing on at this time is really about building and deepening and solidifying relationships and circles of care, so that we might be able to bring these services out and back to community. So that's where we're at right now.
Thank you so much. And for your notes around bringing it back to community in particular as well. Jenna.
I think that I like to remind myself that we're all sacred. And I think that scarcity plays a huge role in power and control. And the world has been defined on, who is more powerful and who is more oppressed. But scarcity always excludes people. And I think we have to remember that there is room for everyone. There's room for the sacred responsibilities of all the genders, and they're all allowed to be in the room at the same time for their own vision and their own purpose. And I just encourage people to, stand in your sacredness at all times. And there's times where, my feminism can really hit some people. And I have to be mindful, is my feminine side coming out to heal and create calm space, or am I coming across as sharp? So I think, my own mindfulness really has to be worked on. My own biases, my own pain that I've carried have to be in check. And us as humans, we're constantly navigating what's safe and unsafe. So, I, like Dahlia said, I like to slow things down and take a look. I wish my brain would function faster sometimes and make these decisions faster, but I need to take some time and I hold my breath a lot. I recognize when my breath is being held that I'm not making the best decisions. And I watch other people. I watch other people for whether they're carrying stress or whether they're carrying hunger or whether they're carrying scaredness, to just allow space and recognize your own sacred purpose and just make room for all of it.
Thanks, Jenna. Misanka.
I really like everything that was said by Dahlia and Jenna. I think I'm gonna echo the same sentiment. I think we're in the moment in time historically that we're finding ourselves in with everything that is going on. In this sort, I think that there are many opportunities for growth for transformative justice because there are there are going to be many opportunities for community, um, because those systems are not going to protect us, and they have shown that they had no intention of protecting us in the way that we have been able to survive and to continue to try to thrive is by community, is by showing up for one another and for trying um, to protect one another and to move forward together. And the only way to do that is by also reviewing how we address conflict and how do we minimize the harm that can happen in community, because unfortunately by living in proximity, those systems we're working through making them fall, but they're still standing strong and they're still going to stand strong for a little while. So we're bound to face harm again. And so the only thing that we can really do is things to how do we prevent them? And when harm happens, how do we still show up for one another? How do we still try to be in community? Because like I said, as time is going to go on, I really genuinely have a belief that all we do have is one another, and all we can do is show up for one another. And I genuinely believe that that is what has kept us um still here. I'm still here because my ancestors lived together and believe that I deserve to be here, and I do think that we deserve um to have people who look like us be there after we're there. And the only way that we can ensure that that happens is if we, have reverence for our community, have reverence for ourselves, and strive in trying to protect each other from those larger system without justifying harm or, being okay with being too harmful towards one another. Yeah.
Thank you so, so much. I think that your note, Misanka, about we all deserve to be here is a great way to wrap us up. And of course, the insights that were shared by both Jenna and Dahlia in this final question as well. And with that, Jenna, Misanka, and Dahlia, just thank you so, so much for sharing such insightful and compassionate, I would say, and thought-provoking responses with us. I would say it's safe to say that there's a lot of work to be done just based off of the learnings that we've had here. But I also think that this conversation and those that have been happening over the past couple of days have laid a really, really great foundation for us to consider next steps in this journey. So unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. So again, please join me in just a virtual round of applause if you're able, for our incredible panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise. And thank you to the audience for being here for this really, really critical and important conversation.